was so romantic and so dramatic that a lot of fiction was written about it. And people began to confuse the fiction with the facts of Fort Smith. And that creates something called legends. And legends are fine, but they're local. We have to bear that in mind often. And we had a museum director here once that said, I've never seen the second largest city in the state get so written around in textbooks.
Fort Smith. To some, it's just another city.
Fort Smith to me, well, I don't count it as a frontier city, but I do see Fort Smith as a very historical area.
But to those who live here,
Well, it means an awful lot to me. I went through high school here and the whole public school system here, and then I was away from Fort Smith for about 20 some odd years, 25 years, and I debated whether it would be good to go back to my hometown or not after being away so long, and I'm very glad I did. It's a mighty good town.
a city rich with history that spans back to the early 1800s, and a city that will keep making history for years to come. But before we make history, we have to understand where we came from.
And I feel like that all the publications you read and all the journals that you see, I don't think they've even scratched the surface of the history that's still buried in Fort Smith.
And where it all started.
I know that Greenwood and Fort Smith, they wanted to have some of their own authority over the district, and Denning, which is dividing of the districts in order to keep someone's power from growing too large. So that enabled Fort Smith and Greenwood to have their own county.
1842, and that was the work of John Rogers, which is the reason some people call him the father of Fort Smith. He was actually got a act passed in the legislature, and then as a chartered town, there were certain advantages to the sale of land and laying out the city. 1842, by that, it had actually been a community here since their tax records go back to 1820. And there had been a military establishment here in a town with residents, streets, a ferry, businesses, but the official act was 1842.
There were certain constables, town marshals, certain people who provided city services. It was still very primitive, very primitive. There's an account of there really was no law in Fort Smith. You took your butt shot and the citizens did what they had to do to keep the law and order. There were, as I said, constables. They were more likely to put the money from a fine in their own pocket. So it was a pretty wild place. Of course, the city itself, the community began to grow around the fort that was established in 1817. So it had been almost 30 years there had been settlement in the area.
And John Rogers actually came here as a post-settler. There had been one before him, Hugh Glenn, who had moved on up to Three Rivers. John Rogers was at Fort Gibson as well, and he was here, and he was a businessman, a veteran himself of the Army, but also a businessman, and in the charter of the town, as he saw it, improved its attractiveness to new settlement and to new business.
John Rogers is known as the founder or the father of Fort Smith. Captain John Rogers was a veteran of the War of 1812. He was from Pennsylvania, but he came to Fort Smith from New Orleans in 1819 as Army settler, which he sold supplies to the soldiers here at the first fort. And following his military service, he decided he wanted to remain in the area, and he opened the first general store on Garrison Avenue. He opened the first hotel in Fort Smith, and he was the postmaster for many, many years, 50 years or so, from the late 1820s through till his death in 1860. And here at the museum we have his mail cabinet that he used as postmaster. And he began to buy property around the area. And when during the late 1830s, it was citizens were pushing for a new fort. The first fort, built in 1817 on the banks of the Arkansas River at Bell Point, was pretty much only used for a supply depot. It had fallen into disrepair. The soldiers had not been stationed there since 1824. And so there was a push. The citizens wanted a new fort. And there was debate about that. Zachary Taylor at that time was commander of the fort, and he did not see the necessity of a new fort. But Captain Rogers really pushed for it. He wrote a letter to the Congress saying this is why we need this fort. And of course, Captain Rogers owned all the land. So he was able to make a nice profit when the fort it did go through and the second fort was built.
He had the land and was encouraging Fort Smith to grow, and he did anything he could to promote its growth. And I do know that he sold the excess land that the military bought in order to set up the fort, and he fought for that.
Now there were different areas. Van Buren was looked at as a site for the second fort, but Fort Smith was chosen. John Rogers sold the land for a little less money than they were going to sell in Van Buren. So he wanted to see this happen, but he was a businessman too, quite an entrepreneur, so he made a lot of money on the deal. But the second fort was built. It was quite a place. It was a lot of social activities took place at the fort. It was kind of the center of community life in the town. And by 1842, the fort was pretty much complete. The town was growing, and it was time to incorporate.
1846. War was brewing in the southeast between Mexico and the United States. Fort Smith would send what help they could, whether in the form of supplies or heroes.
The Mexican-American War was a shipping out place. General Bonneville, at that time I believe he's still Captain, Benjamin Bonneville left from here leading a group of soldiers. And it was a pretty big deal. Fort Smith was kind of a jumping off point to head down to Mexico. So it was good for the economy of the city. Sure, you'd have all the soldiers around preparing to leave, so it was positive for Fort Smith.
And Fort Smith was one of the ones who had some of the volunteers, and it was comprised of like around 250 men.
During the war, Fort Smith would be a supply center for troops in Texas and in northern Mexico. And that may seem like a strange supply chain, but and to man the fort, probably it was one of the first times in history that, in military history, that the state militia would actually be responsible for a federal military installation. It would actually be Zachary Taylor who entered the first skirmishes down below the Nueces River that led to, and when reports get back to Washington, it leads to the declaration of war.
He was here as commander of the fort, and he was a well-known personality. This was before he was elected president, but he was already well-known. And Zachary Taylor did not like it here. He, rather than staying at the fort with the other soldiers, he lived in a home away from the river. He didn't like the humidity, the mosquitoes, the smells. He just really never liked Fort Smith. And there, I think he was not for the second fort, but yet he was a respected general. He was doing his job, I guess, but although he didn't really much want to be here.
1847. During the turmoil of the Mexican-American War, opposing views were common and sometimes violent, often ending in fistfights. Sometimes the parties just talked it out. However, John Roan and Albert Pike did it their own unique way.
John S. Roan, who had organized the Van Buren Avengers that was part of this unit, and was a lawyer in Van Buren, he and Albert Pike began to exchange remarks that get into print that could be considered insulting. And in those days, men of honor, if they were insulted in public, they asked for a duel.
The duel on the sandbar in the Arkansas River. Yes, Albert Pike was a good friend of John Drennan, who lived right across the river in Van Buren. And they, John Drennan served as his second, and it's just, you wonder, were they serious? You know, you would think somebody could have shot somebody. That it was quite a show from what I gather. The typical politeness of a duel. And I believe they missed 3 times.
They fired at each other the first time. They missed. They both missed. They reloaded. They had a second attempt. Pike was angered because Roan's ball went through his beard, he said. He sat down on a log and demanded a third attempt. But the seconds, is sometimes done in those cases, declared that the honor had been avenged on the part of both men, and so they shook hands and walked off. Oh, it's a booming future. It's amazing the people that this city has produced as it is. It's the laundry list of famous people who've gone through these schools and made their mark on not only state but national and international developments is quite amazing.
The future, it's been said that Fort Smith is constantly reinventing, and I would say that's true. At first, of course, you had to have the river, then later the railroad. Okay, we're growing, we're changing, and we're still doing that today. Today, for most of my life here in Fort Smith was a manufacturing center, and that has changed. That's changed just within my lifetime. I've seen this drastic change. Many of the large manufacturing industries have moved away or closed, and now the city is striving to provide more technology-based jobs, more higher skilled, higher paying jobs to replace the manufacturing jobs that were lost. And so I think we're trying to step up and keep up with the times and reinvent once again.
In the state, but if you look at the Fayetteville, Springdale, Bentonville area, they're growing in leaps and bounds, and I think probably within the next 20-25 years they're going to outgrow Fort Smith, and it's not going to be the second largest city in the state.
Nobody can predict the future, but we can all look at the past. And it's our ability to acknowledge our past achievements, tragedies, advancements, and setbacks that make us human. But to move on and better ourselves makes us a community.